Normal people become terrified of criminals.
Shots were just fired. Police just came out and told us, and we're headed there right now.
They become terrified of their own government.
I typically am just at a loss for words in terms of the moral arguments between two political bodies that are not the United States and that have like nothing to do with me and what I want or my taxpayer dollars.
And where we don't really speak those languages. It's like
I'm like, people are like,
well, we're paying for it though. We're giving the weaponry.
So my issue is like, you got to justify why we're doing that and why we spend our tax dollars, why everyone in this country is working so hard dealing with stagnant wages and high cost of goods. And then someone's going to come and say, we're going to give Israel whatever they want. I'm like, listen, I certainly don't want Israel to be destroyed. I don't want Jews to be targeted and killed. I don't want Palestinians dying. But there's a war over there. So I'm just like, the moral arguments, well, Israel was there and they were doing this. I'm like, look, man, it means nothing to me. Right? So if an argument was, hey, you're an American, you pay taxes. Do you have a good answer for why it is a large portion of your savings are diluted through this policy of just mass spending, deficit spending, and giving foreign countries military aid? It's like, I don't really know. Then maybe we shouldn't do that.
I know why it is for Israel.
But if the argument is
it's a colony.
Israel is morally bad for these reasons, but wait, what about the Palestinians, Hamas? They did these things and the people in Gaza support. I'm like, well, that's a debate for the people who are at war with each other and not for the United States. How about that?
It's interesting, though. I mean, I was reading an article in the Washington Post today about the pre-planning of the attack on October 7th. And apparently it was like years in the making. And there were
2 years.
Yeah, it was like 2 years in the making. And there was, I mean, it's sort of fascinating, the planning, because the intentions, according to this article, were for the attackers to get all the way to the West Bank. That was part of their goal. And also to sort of show some defiance to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And also they had two books, two sets of books. They had like the two sets of communication. They had the communication with each other and the communication that they knew Israel was listening to. So it was very organized. But just to go back to what we were talking about with the Students for Justice in Palestine, that is a national movement. They have chapters on campuses all over the country, and they're not a not-for-profit, and the national organization is not a not-for-profit. They are umbrellaed by an organization called the Westpac Foundation in Westchester. So they are able to take tax-deductible contributions. And when those students are saying that they are the movement, it's not a grassroots. Students for Justice in Palestine is not a grassroots organization.
They said Palestinians in exile. Like,
right.
They're saying they're actual Palestinians who are in support of...
Sure, I think they're probably accurate with that. And that student group, as well as Jewish Voices for Peace, was also banned on the Columbia University and Barnard campuses.
Really? What?
Yeah. They staged they staged like a, what was it? It was like a national strike on Thursday, and there was some upsetness on the campus, and there were some sit-ins. So those groups were banned on the Columbia campus as well.
I'm like...
But it is part of like a national organization. So it isn't just like banning, it isn't just saying like, hey, you formed this student group and you got funds from the Student Action Committee or whatever. It is part of a national, very organized group that has funding that we can't track because they have an umbrella group and they are basically an NGO.
Oh, I ban corporations from...
I'm not advocating for or against. I'm just giving
in terms
information.
Of war, I do not believe that morality is determined based on the strength of a single party. So we'll get as specific as we can. Israel, Palestine. Israel is not wrong because they're more powerful than Palestine. Israel wins a conflict, and that doesn't mean they're morally right or wrong. Two different groups of people are fighting for a variety of reasons, and they believe they're right and they're justified. Many people would agree with one side or the other, and they'll make those arguments here in the United States and then fight about it. My view is kind of like, don't know why I'm paying for it. And just because Israel is more powerful doesn't mean they're inherently bad. If two groups are fighting, I don't know what you want me to, what do you want to do about it? There's really interesting conundrums as it pertains to how you deal with these things. Let me give you a scenario and ask, like, there's no good way to do a one-for-one analogy, but here, an example would be, there is a mass shooter in a mall unloading an AR-15 at a bunch of different storefronts, and he's hitting several people. A man runs up, aims his weapon at the shooter to stop him, but he's standing in front of a crowd of people. Is the answer, do not shoot at him because you will also hit the people behind him.
Jeez.
I'm not saying I'm not saying I know what is right or wrong. I'm saying that if the issue is,
it's the trolley problem too.
But the analogy to me is flawed because Hamas right now is not a threat en masse to the people of Israel. And also, again, before October 7th, Israel was occupying Gaza. So if, for example...
What does that mean, occupying?
They had it besieged. They had completely cut it off from the world. You couldn't... If you're in Gaza, you're stuck there for life. You can't leave. Israel controls everything you do.
What about Egypt?
Well, they had
Egypt also was participating in the blockade.
Right, so it's not just Israel, it's Egypt too.
But it's under Israeli control. Israel has a list of everybody there. Israel even calculated the amount of calories that people could eat without fully starving.
But they were also allowing all the money from Qatar to go in, like $30 million.
Netanyahu was allowing Qatar to pop up Hamas because he saw Hamas as a way to undermine international calls for a two-state solution. Because even though Hamas in recent years has actually tried to moderate its position and say they accept a Palestinian state in the occupied territories, Netanyahu rightly saw their internal divisions and the divisions inside the Palestinian factions as a way to undermine calls for a two-state solution. So yes, Netanyahu, and he said this at a meeting, it was quoted, he said the way to stop a Palestinian state is to prop up Hamas.
And that's been recognized for a long time. Just to specify, the Hamas leaders, according to this article I read today, I don't have a ton of information on this, but the Hamas leaders were saying that they were advocating, they were saying like, oh, we're comfortable with peace, we're happy with the situation as it is. As they were planning the attack, it was like a diversion tactic.
Listen, I think there's a split inside Hamas, and I think, from what I understand, and a lot of the details of October 7th are still murky. We don't know exactly, I think, the proportion of people, for example, who were killed on the Israeli side who were military. I don't deny there were civilians killed in horrible atrocities. But we also don't know how many people were killed by Israeli fire, because we know that Israeli helicopters fired on some of those areas where the Hamas people were inside the Israeli kibbutzim. And some of those people were burned alive. And I don't think Hamas rockets could cause that. I could be wrong. But what I'm saying is there's a lot we don't know about October 7th. We do know there were atrocities by Hamas. That is clear. But a lot of the details are still unclear. And also what the goals were of this operation. And there's a split inside Hamas. There are people inside Hamas who didn't even know about this. And there are people inside Hamas who...
Well, the political leaders, right?
There are people inside Hamas who advocated accepting a Palestinian state within the West Bank and Gaza. Other people rejected that. So I think it's hard to describe the movement as a monolith.
The question would be, who started the fight?
Well, I think the fight was started by Israel in 1948 when it was founded on ethnic cleansing.
Well, that's the war.
Well, okay, so this round of the fight, you could say, yes, Hamas did, but again, these are not two equal sides. One side is...
What does equality matter in war?
Well, because if you're apportioning blame, and you have one side that's occupying another, that's preventing people from living normal lives.
Egypt?
Egypt was participating in the blockade.
Right, but
Israel,
Egypt
the occupying...
could open up the Rafah crossing and say, everyone, you're free to come.
They could let everyone flee, but then that's a dilemma, because then you're basically accepting Israel's ethnic cleansing goals. Israel wants to drive all those people out, which it's doing now. And so Egypt, yes, Egypt was totally complicit in...
So both Egypt and Israel are at odds with each other, and the Gazans are caught in the middle?
Yes, but again, Israel's the occupying power. Israel controls everything that gets into Gaza, the fuel,
even the
medical
crossing.
Supplies.
Like Israel won't allow Egypt to allow things in?
Egypt being a U.S. client state, which gets a lot of money from the U.S. and doesn't want to do anything to defy the U.S., basically obeyed orders. And so yes, Egypt has plenty of complicity. I've no kind things to say about them. But Israel is the power that displaced all these people in Gaza to begin with, has occupied them, has besieged them, has routinely attacked them. This is not the first Israeli attack on Gaza. There's been many. And all this has been done with the goal of solidifying Israeli settler colonialism, which goes back to Israel's founding. So in terms of who started the fight, I think it starts with Israel, and it's their obligation to end it.
You said 1948.
Yeah.
What started that fight?
Well, then you have a Zionist movement recognizing that there are people inside the land of Palestine which they want to colonize. Jabotinsky, who was an early Zionist leader, said Zionism is a colonizing project. Lord Balfour, who was the British official who promised a Jewish homeland in Palestine, said...
With that letter.
With that letter, he said, we're going to, I'm paraphrasing him, he said, we're going to go ahead with this because even though, yes, this isn't a inconvenience or it's a hindrance to the Arabs who live there, but the Zionist project is more important. And so when you deny people the right to nationhood in their own land, there's going to be a problem. And Israel accomplished that with ethnic cleansing. That's not a dispute now. And then in 1967, Israel then brings millions of more people under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. And ever since then, it's been this current phase of outright military occupation. And yes, Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, but really that was just the occupation, just in a different guise.
So my view on this is the fight didn't start in 1948, right?
Okay.
I mean, the fight just goes back ad infinitum to the dawn of time, basically to the years of biblical legend.
It goes before that.
It goes well before that.
Before the kingdom of Judea even existed, there were the Canaanites.
my thing is just like
according to the Bible. According to the Bible.
No, not according to the Bible.
According to genetic history, 90,000 years there have been hominids living there. 90,000 years.
Yeah, and I'm not talking about the Bible.
Cool.
I'm talking about the fact that Jews lived there.
Yeah.
Thousands of years ago.
At the start of the 20th century, there was, I don't know, the number of, the percentage of Jews in Palestine, I think was maybe 5%, maybe even less than that. And then you had, and I understand this because I know my history of Jewish people, a lot of persecution. And that increased support for this idea of a Jewish homeland, which certainly ramped up with the Nazi Holocaust. So you had a huge migration in the 20th century of Jews to Palestine. But before that, though, you had times when Jews and Palestinians were living in relative peace. And the conflict only comes with the Zionist project, with this attempt to colonize Palestine.
I heard that when Arthur Balfour signed the Balfour Declaration during World War I and basically screwed the Arabs out of Palestine, they were like, hey, Arabs, betray the Ottomans and we'll give you that land. The Arabs were like, okay, they betrayed the Ottomans. The British won the war. And then the British were like, psych, we're keeping it for ourselves. That is what led to the Germans hating the Jewish people leading up to World War II. So it created all this. They were like, they stole it. The Zion, they created a land of Israel, like with these Jewish. So that's where all this German hate came from.
They were hating
It's just
them.
something I heard
They were
recently and it made
hating
total
anyway.
sense.
Yeah.
I mean,
But what a screw over. They lost World War I because
Sure,
the
but
land with.
There were pogroms in the Middle Ages.
It's been going on for thousands of years.
Way
Yeah.
even before. I mean,
But the modern German sentiment.
Yeah,
came.
I mean, there was all this stuff also in the Middle Ages. Jews in Europe, for the most part, were not allowed to own property. And so that's why you have that's why you ended up with a history of Jews involved in banking and lending. Right. It's because they weren't allowed to own property. So they had to find some other way to make an income.
I'm just thinking what's the solution?
Well, listen, for me, ideally, it would be equality for everybody because I don't believe in the supremacy of any ethnicity. Even though there's a big history of persecution of Jews.
Let me ask you a question.
So that's my ideal. But the international consensus has long been a two-state solution.
And so that would be like the West Bank and Gaza being connected by that little travel corridor or something.
Yeah, and remove all the Israeli settlements. Why should somebody from
settlements where
in the occupied West Bank? Why should somebody from Brooklyn have more rights than the people who've lived there forever?
They took all the settlements out of Gaza. I mean, they evicted.
Yes, they did, and they put Gaza under a medieval blockade. In fact,
what I'm saying is they took all the settlements out.
Yes, they did.
But none of that means anything because right now there are people who live in houses and they're not party to what you're describing. Someone maybe moved in later and got a house and they live somewhere. The kibbutzes in Israel that got attacked. Some of these people are just like, I bought a house. I don't know.
Yeah.
So what would happen? Do you think if the barriers around Gaza were completely removed? And Israel said all people of Gaza are free to move about the state of Israel.
Well, if Israel did that and they finally took responsibility.
I'm saying, what happened if they just moved the barricades and said, everyone, you're free to move as you please?
Well, at this point now, people are so destitute, they'd be looking for water and food. So after you sorted that out and people actually got their basic needs, which Israel is depriving them of. Look, I've been to Gaza. I've been to the West Bank. People just want to live in peace and freedom.
Would the people go back to the land they believe belongs to them and their ancestors?
Unless Israel tried to have a just resolution to that, which also is the international consensus. Palestinians have the right to return. They were removed. Now, you could argue now that's no longer feasible. It's true. I'm not giving up my home now to an indigenous person, even though an indigenous person lived there, I'm sure, before and were ethnically cleansed a long time ago. So we recognize that historical injustices happen. And you have to find a way to address it in a fair way. But the problem is Israel's never accepted responsibility.
But it doesn't matter because you can't.
Well, you can at least accept responsibility for the ethnic cleansing. Here now, we acknowledge that this land was created on stolen indigenous land. Israel could do the same thing.
We don't acknowledge that.
I don't acknowledge that at all.
Yeah. No,
okay. Well,
absolutely
no chance.
No chance.
I do, for what it's worth, and many
they
people
bought Manhattan. Manhattan was paid for legally.
Okay. let's not debate that. The point is, if you accept the historical truth that there was ethnic cleansing in 1948,
but people don't. They're just
okay. Well, then you can go to the Israeli archives and read all about it. Benny Morris, who's the top Israeli historian who supports this project, says it was a good thing. Says that it didn't go far enough. His term is ethnic purification.
But none of that matters.
Well, it does matter, because if Israel took responsibility for it finally and said, we stole your homes, we're sorry for it. Now we have a problem where we have all these people here. We built up a state. We're not going to let everyone come back, but we will compensate for you and apologize. That could be a starting point.
That does not solve the problem.
It could. Well, so the alternative is what? Permanent occupation.
I'm not saying I have a solution. I'm saying the idea.
This is what I'm proposing: is take responsibility, apologize, and remove all the settlements from the West Bank.
And so that means there are people who are there who have no idea. Like
yes,
they got a house and they moved in and they were like, wow, we're moving into a house. And now it's like the government's going to come and take their land from them.
Yes.
And then you know what they're going to do? They're going to say, my land was taken from me by the government in some ridiculous deal that I don't agree with. And then they're going to start.
Except there's something.
So there we go.
Under international law, you cannot build up territory you've acquired by force. It's a pretty basic
But is the government doing it?
The Israeli government.
And so a civilian who gets a house.
Yes.
What happens to them and their property and their net worth and their? I am not saying what's happening there is good.
Put them back in 1948 Israel, which again
doesn't matter. That's meaningless. That means nothing.
Well, Israel
you can't go back and say, well, back then someone did something. I'm saying right now,
Israel has recognized international boundaries.
Right
nobody
now.
Nobody recognizes
talking about the geography of what it was in 48.
But does it mean anything?
Nobody recognizes Israel.
You're not going to take someone's house from them. It's not going to work. You're going to get bloodshed.
Well, first of all, Israel takes Palestinians' homes all the time.
And it's bad and it's bloodshed.
Yeah, all the time.
And so
it does
right
it
now,
by massacring
if the argument is equality for all and everyone can return, okay, then what's going to happen is...
That wasn't my argument.
You said...
I mean, ideally I said it should be equality for all, because I believe all people are created equal. So why wouldn't I support that? But it's not practical. I agree with that. It's not practical.
The implication is the right of return.
Yes.
That there's land now where Israelis live.
Yes.
And the Palestinians would get to return to that land, displacing the people who live there now.
I'm saying you recognize the right, and you now, just because you recognize a right, that doesn't mean you fully implement everything that comes with it. You, at least though, you have to, if there's a historical injustice and it's still causing so much justice.
Okay, but listen,
you have to at least recognize it.
And so if Israel came out and said, yes, we stole your land.
Yes,
we occupied you, and we're not going to give it back. You think that's gonna be like, well, we're cool, thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Well, listen, I understand why Palestine would never accept that, because their land was stolen from them. If you meet, so many Palestinians still have the keys to their homes. I'm trying to think of a practical solution to this horrible problem. And ideally, I think everyone should have the right to come back to their homes, because I do believe in equality. If we accept, though, that Israel has these recognized boundaries and Israel has nuclear weapons, and so the idea of getting them to accept equality is pretty impractical, then at least at minimum, the very minimum we should do is recognize the historical injustice that's happened to Palestinians and then work within that to find a solution. And to me, it's based on international law. These settlements have no right to be there. Remove all of them.
But what right? What does that mean?
You can't build up your population in territory you've stolen.
So
that's the history of the
Jews
world.
Are not indigenous to the Middle East?
I know there's been a small Jewish population in the Middle East for a long time, but do I look like I come from the Middle East? I mean, you meet many Jews. They're from Ukraine. They're from Eastern Europe. Like this idea that like
how far back do we go to restore?
If someone came to your house holding up a Bible and saying, "Hey, my family lived here 3,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago," does that give you a right? But does that give them a right to come and take your home? Because that's basically like the Zionist.
So what is the time frame then? 50 years?
Yeah, I mean, we're in this modern era of the United Nations. Israel was recognized by the UN within certain borders, not within the West Bank and Gaza.
So if you give it 50 years, then if it's 50 years, then give it 50 years, and then there'll be total peace.
You're right.
Well,
okay, so I agree. Let's say in 50 years we'll just call the land, and we're done.
And then it's peaceful.
Okay,
and everyone's happy.
You're asking me for solutions right now.
Right. The issue is, I think
what I'm proposing is a historic compromise, and I'm not sure Palestinians would even accept it, because their land is all of Palestine. They were there. They were ethnically cleansed. We're asking them to accept 22% of historic Palestine. And Israel, with U.S. backing, are such fanatics, they couldn't even give Palestinians that. All these claims that Palestinians have been offered a generous peace deal of the state, it's all a lie. Israel's never been willing to give up control of the major West Bank settlements. That's the problem here.
What do you think about Burma?
What do you think about Burma?
Yeah.
I don't have strong opinions about Burma.
Why do you think? Or how about Azerbaijan and Armenia?
That's a fascinating situation.
I think that was a horrible thing that happened. I'm also not as familiar with it as I am this issue.
I don't understand why people are just like Israel. 110%, everything about it all the time. And I'm just like, bro, I'm sitting here in America, like, I don't know why we're
because
involved
the
in
U.S.
any of
is funding it.
The
Yeah,
US
but
is
U.S.
funding it.
provides funding to
Oh my
Armenia
goodness.
and
Tim,
Azerbaijan.
did you know
it's
this?
Israel, dude.
Insurgencies have been going on in Myanmar since 1948.
And there's several 100,000 dead since then.
Yes,
And this year alone,
look
I
at
think it's
that.
been twice.
Can you think
There's communist
Is there one
insurgencies.
U.S. politician or corporate media pundit who goes on TV and
No, I agree.
apologizes?
That's the point. The point is like, why?
Yeah.
Why is it
because
Israel?
because we're responsible for it, and because the injustice.
I bet you
is
could
so-
figure
so
out a way
stark.
that we're responsible for Myanmar too. I'm
sure you
sure
could.
that we had our hands in there somewhere.
I'm sure you could.
All I'm saying is like we need to get back to America first, and I'm
Totally
sure
agree.
at the bare minimum, like there are many people who I see are like very critical of Israel, and I'm like, I don't know what that's all about, and I don't want to get into a moral argument. Should the U.S. stop funding everything outside of the United States and go back to securing its borders, building up jobs here, helping the working class, maybe fixing some of the pipes and the roads and infrastructure? We can agree because
That would be cool.
The people were like, stop funding Israel, and I'm like, stop funding everything?
But what about Puerto
Hey.
Rico? Puerto Rico, not a state, but should we stop funding them?
No, Puerto Rico's awesome.
Puerto Rico. So Israel's kind of like a client state of the U.S.
No, it's
do you
territory.
think?
What do you
Do you
mean?
think that the?
I mean, it's
do you
technically
think-
a country, but it's used like a
It's a
client
territory
state.
of the United States. They're American citizens. They
No,
have
Puerto
American.
Rico is. Puerto Rico.
No, I've said Israel. Israel is.
Oh,
a
Puerto Rico
client
become a
state.
state?
No,
No. That's
How
not what I
come?
mean.
maybe. But
I'm
It's
just
interesting.
saying we
they
can't.
vote on that every now and then.
Defunding
Yeah, not
Israel
yet.
would be like
I don't think they
defunding
want to be
Puerto
states.
Rico.
I don't
because
think
of-
so
because of
either.
taxes.
In the minds of the media and the people that are running the government, defunding Israel would be like defunding Puerto Rico. They use it like a client.
Well, I see what you're saying, but the thing about Puerto Rico is that the U.S. has a ton of territorial islands, and they're all not going to become states.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of complicated legal nonsense pertaining to the creation of a new state, whether Puerto Rico should become a state. And the big issue right now is I don't think the U.S. is actually able to solve its own regional problems with like Greater Idaho and Northern California. So
That's a fascinating situation too. The Oregon counties that want to secede.
bringing Puerto Rico in as a state would further destabilize an already tumultuous situation in the United States. So that's why I say maybe. Thanks for watching this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. Hang out with us live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. and become a member over at timcast.com for uncensored, members-only shows exclusive. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.